What if the darkest secrets of a forgotten town weren't buried deep in history but alive, lurking just beyond the edge of your vision? In this chilling tale, a restless stranger arrives in a remote American town, shrouded in silence and whispers of an ancient curse. As strange events escalate, the line between reality and nightmare blurs, and survival means facing horrors that no one dares to name. Brace yourself for a story of fear, mystery, and the haunting question: how far would you go to escape a curse that refuses to die? The moment Emily stepped off the creaking wooden porch, a chill wrapped around her like a warning. The wind howled low through the skeletal branches of the towering oaks that ring the old Garrison farmstead, carrying with it the faintest trace of something metallic, a scent like rusted iron and forgotten blood. It was a smell that clung to the air, a silent herald of the darkness that clung to this land. Emily had never believed in curses or ghost stories, but standing here, alone on the outskirts of Marrow Creek, the stories her grandmother whispered back home in Ohio flickered in her mind like dying candle flames. They said the Garrison place was cursed, a forgotten patch of earth that swallowed hope and sanity whole. And yet, it was the only home left to her. The town of Marrow Creek was nestled deep in the Appalachian foothills, where the fog rolled in thick, swallowing streets and secrets alike. It was the kind of place that time forgot, where the sheriff was more myth than man, and the locals spoke in hushed tones about things better left unspoken. The kind of town where the past refused to die. Emily's fingers tightened around the worn leather strap of her duffel bag as she gazed up at the dilapidated farmhouse. Its windows, like dark, hollow eyes, stared back at her with a cold indifference. The paint peeled in ragged strips, revealing rotting wood beneath, and the porch sagged under years of neglect. She swallowed hard and stepped forward, each footfall crunching on brittle leaves scattered across the cracked porch boards. Her arrival wasn't by chance. The letter from her estranged uncle had been terse but insistent. "Come home, Emily. The family needs you." No explanation, no details, just a summons back to the place she'd tried to forget. After her mother's death 2 years ago, Emily thought she'd escaped the shadows of this land forever, but some roots run too deep to be severed. She unlocked the creaking door and pushed inside. The air was thick with dust and something fouler, a hint of decay that settled in her lungs. Faded wallpaper curled at the corners and the floorboards ground underfoot. Cobwebs draped the corners like tattered curtains. It was as if the house itself exhaled a weary sigh, welcoming her back to a place where time had stood still, and darkness waited patiently. Emily's eyes adjusted to the dim light filtering through grimy windows. The kitchen was a museum of abandonment. A rusted kettle on the stove, cracked plates stacked haphazardly, a calendar frozen on October 1973. She traced her fingers over the rough wooden table, imagining the lives that once pulsed here. Laughter, arguments, fear. A sudden tapping noise echoed from upstairs, sharp and deliberate. Emily froze, heart hammering. She told herself it was the wind, or maybe an animal seeking shelter, but deep down she knew better. The house whispered its secrets in creaks and knocks, stories carved into its bones. Her footsteps echoed as she ascended the narrow staircase, each step sending a cloud of dust into the stale air. At the top, the hallway stretched ahead like a gauntlet of shadows. The walls were lined with faded photographs, ancestors with hollow eyes and grim faces staring down at her. One photo caught her breath, a black and white image of a family picnic, smiling faces marred by an unseen dread. Emily's gaze settled on a door at the far end. It was slightly ajar, as if inviting her in. Pushing it open, she stepped into what had once been her mother's room. The faint scent of lavender lingered, battling the mustiness. On the nightstand lay a faded diary, its leather cover cracked but intact. She opened it carefully. The pages were filled with neat handwriting, her mother's voice echoing across time. The entries began innocuously enough, descriptions of daily life, hopes for Emily's future, memories of better days. But as the pages turned, the tone darkened. October 13th. The land is restless. The old stories say the Garrison farm holds a curse. I never believed, but I see the signs. The animals are nervous, the night's colder. I hear voices when I should hear silence. Emily's hands trembled. Her mother had been afraid of the land they'd returned to, afraid of something lurking in the shadows. A sudden draft swept through the room, fluttering the diary's pages wildly. The temperature dropped, and Emily wrapped her arms around herself. Outside, the wind seemed to wail louder, carrying with it a mournful, half-remembered lullaby. That night, Emily barely slept. The house groaned and whispered, and distant footsteps seemed to echo down the hallway. Every shadow shifted just out of sight. The isolation gnawed at her, the eerie silence broken only by the restless sighs of a place haunted not just by spirits, but by its own dark history. Marrow Creek's secrets were buried deep, tangled in the land's blood-soaked soil. Emily knew she had to uncover them if she wanted to survive the darkness waiting for her. The morning light struggled to penetrate the heavy fog that clung to the Garrison farmstead like a shroud. Emily woke with a start, the remnants of a nightmare clinging to her mind, indistinct shadows twisting in the dark, whispers just beyond comprehension. She forced herself upright, the worn mattress creaking beneath her. The diary lay open beside her, the faded ink now smudged from restless hands. She needed answers, but more than that, she needed to understand why she had been called back to this place, to this forgotten fragment of Marrow Creek, where the air itself seemed soaked in sorrow. Stepping outside, the cold bit into her skin. The fog obscured everything beyond a few yards, turning the sprawling farm into an island suspended in an otherworldly mist. The skeletal outline of the barn loomed to the left, its weathered boards groaning softly with the wind. Behind her, the ancient oaks whispered secrets in a language only the wind could speak. Emily's boots crunched on the frozen grass as she made her way toward the overgrown path leading into the woods. The forest bordered the property like a dark moat, dense and impenetrable. Locals called it the Black Hollow, a place avoided after dusk, whispered about in hushed tones in the town's one remaining diner. She reached the tree line and paused, glancing back toward the farmhouse. The windows stared back like empty sockets, cold and unforgiving. Swallowing her fear, Emily stepped beneath the canopy of twisted branches, the forest floor muffling her footsteps. The deeper she walked, the heavier the silence became, a suffocating, unnatural stillness that pressed against her ears. Birds were absent, as if all life had been driven away. The fog thickened, swirling around her like phantom fingers. Suddenly, a faint light flickered ahead, a pale glow that pulsed rhythmically like a heartbeat. Emily's breath hitched. She moved closer, branches clawing at her jacket as she pushed forward. In a small clearing, she found it. An old stone well, its rim cracked and covered in moss. The faint glow emanated from within, casting eerie shadows that danced on the surrounding trees. Carved into the stone were indecipherable runes, weathered by time but still unnervingly sharp. Emily leaned over the edge, peering into the darkness below. The glow pulsed again, and for a brief moment she thought she saw movement, a pair of gleaming eyes staring back at her from the abyss. A sudden noise shattered the silence. A soft, childlike giggle that echoed from the shadows beyond the clearing. Emily spun around, heart pounding. But there was nothing, just the fog swirling between the gnarled trunks. She backed away slowly, senses heightened, the forest seeming to close in around her. As she retraced her steps, a cold breeze brushed past her neck, carrying with it a whisper. "Leave before it's too late." The warning settled deep in her bones. Back at the farmhouse, Emily tried to shake off the encounter, but the feeling of unseen eyes watching her lingered. She poured a cup of coffee in the dim kitchen, the silence punctuated by the distant tolling of the town's church bell. Her phone buzzed, a message from her uncle. "Meet me at the old church. We need to talk." No time, no explanation. Curiosity warred with dread. She knew better than to ignore the summons. Wrapping herself in a heavy coat, Emily stepped back into the mist. The path to town was longer than she remembered, winding through the twisted back roads that locals avoided after dark. The old church stood at the edge of Marrow Creek, its weathered steeple piercing the gray sky. The door creaked as she pushed inside, the scent of candle wax and decay thick in the air. Her uncle awaited in the shadows, eyes hollow but intense. "You shouldn't have come back," he said, voice low. "The curse, it's worse than you know." Emily pressed for answers, but he hesitated, glancing nervously toward the stained glass windows that fractured the weak sunlight into fractured colors. "There's a reason the Garrisons left Marrow Creek generations ago," he continued. "A dark pact made long ago, one that demands sacrifice. The land feeds on us, twists us, and is hungry again." Her mind reeled. Was this madness or truth buried beneath layers of family secrets and whispered fears? Suddenly the church doors slammed shut, trapping them in shadow. The temperature plummeted, breaths visible in the freezing air. A voice, distant but unmistakable, echoed through the nave, a mournful lament carried on the wind, speaking in a language older than memory. Emily's uncle grabbed her arm. "You have to leave, tonight, before it's too late." But Emily's eyes were fixed on the altar, where a single flickering candle cast grotesque shadows. Behind her, the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, approached from the darkened aisles. A chill ran down her spine as she realized they were not alone. The sun dipped low behind the Appalachian ridges, casting long, twisted shadows over the weathered streets of Marrow Creek. The town, wrapped in an unnatural silence, seemed frozen in time, a place forgotten by the world, where the past bled into the present with an unrelenting grip. Emily sat alone in the dim corner of the rusted lantern diner, nursing a lukewarm cup of coffee. The clatter of dishes and muffled conversations felt distant, as if the small town's heartbeat had slowed to a sluggish pulse. Her mind replayed the events at the old church, the cryptic warnings of her uncle, and the eerie glow from the stone well. She was drawn deeper into the legacy of the Garrisons, a lineage marked by tragedy, silence, and shadows that refused to fade. Outside, the fog thickened, curling around street lamps like ghostly fingers. The waitress, a gaunt woman with tired eyes and a pinched smile, approached her table. "Not many folks around these days," the woman said softly, eyes flicking toward the window. "You're not from here, are you?" Emily shook her head. "Just visiting, trying to understand some family history." The waitress hesitated, then lowered her voice. "Marrow Creek's got its secrets. Old wounds never heal here. Best you tread careful." Emily offered a tight smile, the unease settling heavier in her chest. She reached into her bag and pulled out the worn diary she'd found in the attic. The pages held cryptic entries, scrawled in a desperate hand, hinting at rituals, curses, and voices from beyond. Her fingers trembled as she traced a passage. "The land demands its due. The silence breaks only with blood." A sudden chill swept through the diner, extinguishing the candles on the tables. The chatter dimmed to a whisper as patrons glanced nervously at the door. Emily's gaze snapped toward the entrance, where a figure stood framed by the fog. Tall, cloaked in shadow, eyes gleaming with an unsettling light. The figure stepped inside, the heavy door groaning behind them. The room seemed to contract, the air thick with tension. Emily's heart pounded as the stranger approached, voice low and rasping. "You shouldn't dig where darkness sleeps," they warned. "Some stones are meant to stay unturned." Before Emily could respond, the stranger vanished as suddenly as they had appeared, leaving behind a faint scent of damp earth and decay. Shaken, Emily returned to her research, determined to piece together the fragments of her family's past. She spent the next day at the Marrow Creek Historical Society, a dusty building cluttered with yellowed records and faded photographs. The archivist, a wiry man named Mr. Harlan, eyed her with suspicion but eventually yielded to her persistence. Hours passed as Emily sifted through old newspapers, legal documents, and diaries, searching for clues. One article caught her eye. "Garrison Farmstead, Site of Tragic Disappearances." The headline was faded, but the story was clear. Several members of the Garrison family had vanished without a trace over the past century, always in late autumn, always near the anniversary of a strange fire that had consumed part of the property decades ago. Another report detailed local legends, tales of a whispering well deep in the forest, said to be cursed by the spirits of those who died unjustly. The well was rumored to grant wishes, but at a terrible price. Emily's mind raced. The well she'd seen in the woods matched the description exactly. Was it the source of the curse her uncle had spoken of? As evening fell, she returned to the farmstead, the oppressive fog now thick as smoke. The familiar path to the well seemed more sinister in the fading light, shadows twisting into unnatural shapes. Her flashlight flickered as she neared the clearing, and she froze. There, carved into the tree trunks surrounding the well, were symbols, identical to those etched into the stone rim, glowing faintly in the darkness. A low hum vibrated in the air, resonating in Emily's chest like a warning drum. From the depths of the well came a faint, mournful song, a lullaby warped by time and sorrow, calling to something buried beneath the earth. Her breath caught, and she stumbled backward, heart racing. Suddenly the ground beneath her shifted. Roots writhed like serpents, and the forest seemed to exhale a long, mournful sigh. Emily's mind screamed for her to run, but her feet were rooted to the spot. From the shadows a figure emerged, a gaunt woman, face pale and eyes hollow, draped in tattered garments that whispered like dead leaves. The woman's voice was a rasping echo. "You seek the truth, child of Garrison, but some truths come with chains." Emily's throat tightened. "What do you want from me?" "To remember," the spirit whispered, "to carry the burden that was mine." Images flooded Emily's mind, flashes of fire, screams, and betrayal. The spirit's story unfolded, a family torn apart by greed and dark pacts, a sacrifice made to bind a malevolent force to the land, a curse passed through generations. "You are bound by blood," the spirit said, "and the land will claim what is owed." Emily staggered back, the weight of the revelation crushing her resolve. She fled the clearing, the lullaby echoing in her ears, promising doom. As she reached the farmhouse, the fog began to recede, revealing the first stars of night. But Emily knew the darkness was far from gone. It waited, patient and hungry, ready to reclaim what had been stolen. And somewhere in the distance, a single, chilling laugh echoed through the woods. Emily barely caught her breath as she stumbled back through the thickening fog, the spirit's words clawing at her mind like a persistent shadow. The ancient forest around the Garrison farmstead seemed to close in tighter, its cold breath brushing against your skin, whispering secrets in the rustling leaves. The weight of a family curse wasn't just a story told to scare children. It was a living, breathing force rooted deep in this soil, feeding on blood and silence. Her hands shook as she pushed open the creaking door of the farmhouse, the heavy scent of mildew and decay greeting her like an unwelcome reminder of the past. Inside, dust particles danced in the fading light, caught in the narrow beams of the setting sun that struggled through grimy windows. The house was a mausoleum of memories, faded photographs, broken furniture, and scraps of letters strewn across the floor. Emily sank into an old rocking chair, clutching the diary tightly. She flipped through the fragile pages, each word more desperate and fragmented than the last. The author, her great-aunt Agnes, had chronicled the family's descent into darkness with chilling clarity. One passage stood out. "The well does not forgive. It remembers every sin, every broken vow. It demands its price in kind." Her mind replayed the visions shared by the spirit, a fire set by hands trusted, a betrayal so deep it severed the bonds of kinship, and a sacrifice made beneath the cold gaze of the well. The malevolent force bound to the land was more than superstition. It was an ancient, living curse. Emily's phone buzzed sharply on the table, breaking her spiraling thoughts. The caller ID flashed Uncle Pete. She hesitated before answering, unsure if she wanted to hear more warnings or empty reassurances. "Emily," his gravelly voice came through, edged with exhaustion. "You need to be careful. The town, they're watching. Not everyone welcomes an outsider digging up old wounds." "What do you mean?" she asked, tension tightening her throat. "There's more than just folklore here. The sheriff's been quiet, but he knows. The local church, the historical society, they all play a part in keeping the secret buried. And the curse? It's not just stories to scare kids. It's real." Emily swallowed hard. "I don't plan to run, but I need to understand what happened here. To my family?" A long pause stretched before them before Pete spoke again, his voice almost a whisper. "Just promise me you'll watch your back. The shadows here don't forget." She hung up, a cold knot settling in her stomach. The deeper she dug, the more she realized the extent of the darkness enveloping Marrow Creek. It wasn't just a cursed land. It was a community bound by fear, silence, and ancient rituals. Determined to find answers, Emily returned to the Historical Society the next morning. The archivist, Mr. Harlan, reluctantly agreed to show her a collection of personal letters and journals donated by the Garrisons. The brittle pages revealed a family history riddled with tragedy, unexplained disappearances, whispered accusations of witchcraft, and a pattern of madness that plagued generations. One letter, dated nearly a century ago, stood out. It described a secret meeting at the well, a pact made under the cover of darkness to protect the family name at any cost. The author's handwriting trembled with fear. "The price we pay binds us all. May the earth swallow our sins, but the blood must flow." Emily's pulse quickened. The well wasn't just a landmark, it was a ritual site, a focal point of the curse. Later that day, she sought out Sheriff Dalton, hoping for clarity. The sheriff, a grizzled man with weary eyes, greeted her with thinly veiled suspicion. "Mrs. Garrison," he said, voice low, "this town's history is complicated. You digging around might stir up things better left alone." "I'm not here to cause trouble," Emily replied evenly. "I just want to understand what happened to my family." Dalton's gaze hardened. "Understanding comes with a price. Some stories have teeth. You'd do well to remember that." She pressed him about the disappearances, the fire, and the well. The sheriff's reluctance only deepened. "They say the forest holds old grudges," he said finally. "Some folks believe the well's cursed, that it's a gateway to things not meant for us. The ones who disappeared, they say they were taken by something hungry, something patient." The conversation left Emily more unsettled, but fueled her resolve. That evening, she wandered back toward the well under a slate-gray sky heavy with rain. The forest was alive with unseen movement. Twigs snapped, leaves rustled, and distant howls echoed as if warning her to stay away. Near the clearing, the carved symbols pulsed faintly, a chilling reminder of the forces at play. Emily knelt to inspect the ground, noticing fresh footprints leading to the well. Too small for any adult, almost childlike. A sudden breeze carried a whisper, barely audible but unmistakable. "Come back." She stood, heart racing, and scanned the tree line. A figure emerged. A boy, no older than 10, pale and shrouded in tattered clothes, eyes void of warmth. "Who are you?" Emily asked, voice trembling. The boy stepped closer, voice hollow. "I'm the one who waits, the one who listens." Before she could respond, the earth beneath the well shuddered violently, sending a shower of dirt and stones into the air. The boy vanished into the darkness, leaving Emily alone with the rising dread. She stumbled back toward the farmhouse, lungs burning from the cold air and panic. Inside, she locked every door and window, the house groaning as if in pain. The diary lay open on the table, its pages fluttering as if caught in a spectral breeze. Emily's phone buzzed again, this time an unknown number. "Emily?" a voice whispered, distorted and urgent. "Hey, the curse is waking. You've disturbed what sleeps. Prepare or be consumed." The line went dead. Her hands shook violently. The curse was no longer a distant nightmare. It was closing in, relentless and unforgiving. As midnight approached, the farmhouse lights flickered. Outside, the fog thickened, swallowing the trees and wrapping the house in a suffocating shroud. Emily glanced toward the window. Shadows moved just beyond the glass, shapes shifting with unnatural fluidity. And then, a single blood-curdling scream pierced the night, cutting through the silence like a knife. The wind howled through the skeletal trees of Marrow Creek as dusk bled into night, casting elongated shadows over the forgotten town. Emily stood at the edge of the abandoned churchyard, the wooden crossbones creaking softly in protest against the relentless breeze. It was a place where the past clung stubbornly to the present, a threshold between what was lost and what refused to die. Her breath formed clouds in the chilly air as she pushed open the rusted iron gate, the screech echoing like a cry from some long-buried soul. This wasn't a place she would have dared to come alone just days ago, but the weight of secrets demanded answers. The stories she'd heard from the locals, hushed whispers about the church's dark history and the rituals once performed within its crumbling walls, gnawed at her mind like persistent roots beneath dry soil. Inside, the pews lay shattered, overtaken by dust and time. The altar, once a beacon of hope, was now a shrine to forgotten fears. Symbols etched in dried blood stained the floorboards, and remnants of candles long extinguished littered the sanctuary. A faint scent of damp earth and decay hung heavy, an unspoken warning. Emily's fingers traced the edge of a weathered book she had found tucked beneath a loose floorboard near the altar. Bound in cracked leather and sealed with a rusted clasp, the volume bore no title, but inside the pages whispered of rituals meant to contain a darkness older than the town itself. She settled onto the creaking wooden steps, the book resting on her knees. As she leaped through the brittle pages, her eyes caught on a passage detailing the binding rite, an ancient ceremony said to seal away the malevolent force haunting the Garrison family's land. The instructions were cryptic, filled with archaic language and ominous warnings about the consequences of failure. Her heart pounded as the implications sank in. The curse was not simply a tale, but a cycle, a ritual trap set centuries ago, meant to imprison something unspeakable beneath the well and the surrounding forest. Footsteps outside jolted Emily from her reverie. She closed the book hastily and moved toward the shattered stained glass window, peering through the gloom. A figure approached, Sheriff Dalton, his face grim, eyes shadowed with fatigue and something unspoken. "Emily," he called softly, his voice barely carrying over the rustling leaves. "This place, it's more dangerous than you realize." She stepped outside to meet him, the chill seeping into her bones. "I need to understand it, Sheriff. If the curse is real, if it's tied to that well and the rituals, I have to know how to stop it." Dalton shook his head. "Stopping it isn't that simple. The town's kept this secret for generations. There are those who believe the curse protects us, that breaking the cycle will bring worse things." Emily's eyes narrowed. "Worse than what's already happening? People disappearing, strange voices, those shadows lurking in the trees?" The sheriff sighed heavily. "It's not just superstition. Years ago, a group tried to end the curse. They performed a ritual, but it went wrong. The result was catastrophic. Some of them never came back. The forest took them. The curse fought back." She swallowed hard, a cold dread settling over her. "Then what's the way forward?" Dalton's gaze flickered toward the forest's edge. "You have to complete what they started. Finish the binding rite the right way. But you won't be alone in this." Emily's heart quickened. "Who else knows?" "The descendants," Dalton replied, lowering his voice. "The Garrison bloodline. They're scattered, broken. Some have tried to escape the past, but it follows them like a shadow. You'll need help, people who remember, who believe." Suddenly a twig snapped behind them, sharp and deliberate. Both spun around, eyes straining to pierce the darkness. Nothing moved, only the oppressive silence pressing against them. Emily clenched the book tighter. The path ahead was darker than she had imagined, but retreat was no longer an option. The town's secrets were unraveling, and the curse's grip was tightening. That night, back at the farmhouse, Emily gathered the few items she had found: a rusted knife with strange runes, the ancient book, and a faded photograph of her great-grandmother standing near the cursed well. The past and present collided in her hands like fractured glass. As the clock struck midnight, a low hum began to rise outside, vibrating through the floorboards and walls. The fog thickened, swirling against the windows like living smoke. Then, from the depths of the forest, a mournful wail pierced the night, a sound that was neither fully human nor beast. Emily's pulse raced, her breath shallow. The curse was waking, stirring from its slumber, and with it, the shadows deepened. She lit a candle, its flickering flame casting long, jittering shapes across the room. Holding the ancient book open, she read aloud the first lines of the binding rite. Words foreign, yet strangely familiar. echoing with power. As she spoke, the air grew heavier, the temperature dropping. Outside, the ground near the well trembled faintly. The forest seemed to hold its breath. Suddenly, the candle went out. Darkness enveloped her, thick and suffocating. Then, a whisper, a voice, close, almost inside her mind. Finish what was begun, or be lost forever. Emily's heart thundered. The ritual had begun, but the night was far from over. The oppressive darkness lingered long after the candle's flame died, leaving Emily stranded in a void of silence and cold. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the matches on the worn wooden table, striking one with a snap that seemed loud enough to shatter the stillness. The tiny flame flickered, hesitant, before steadying. Shadows danced again on the peeling wallpaper, and the weight of the night pressed in, thick and suffocating. She returned to the book, forcing herself to continue reading despite the dread pooling in her chest. The binding rite was a labyrinth of strange symbols and arcane instructions, a ritual demanding precision and resolve. Every line carried the risk of awakening something far worse than the curse itself. Outside, the wind clawed at the farmhouse walls, howling like a beast desperate to be free. Emily's thoughts drifted to the sheriff's warning. This was no ordinary curse, no simple superstition passed down in whispered tales. It was a living thing, a wound festering beneath the town's surface, fed by generations of fear and silence. Her phone vibrated sharply against the table. She jumped, heart pounding, then grabbed it, eyes wide. It was a message from Jake. "You all right? Heard you were at the old church. Be careful." Emily typed back quickly. "I'm fine. Found something. Need your help." She hadn't told anyone else about the book, the ritual, or the growing sense that time was running out. Jake was the only one she trusted, the only person who understood the burden she carried. A knock came at the door, soft but insistent. Emily froze, breath hitching. No one was supposed to know she was here. "Emily, it's me," Jake's voice called through the wood. Relief washed over her. She opened the door to find him standing there, face pale in the moonlight, eyes sharp with worry. His jacket was damp from the fog, and the weight of the night seemed to hang on his shoulders. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered. "Neither should you. What's going on?" "I've been hearing things, weird things. People talking about the curse waking up." Emily stepped aside, letting him in. The house felt smaller now, the shadows crowding the corners, watching. She pulled the book from the table. "This is why. The binding rite. It's real, Jake, and we're running out of time." He frowned, scanning the worn pages. Where do we even start? Emily bit her lip, recalling the cryptic instructions. There are 4 parts. We have to find the sacred items. An ancient dagger, a vial of holy water, a lock of hair from the first victim, and a candle made from tallow of the black goat. Only then can the ritual be performed at the well. Jake shook his head, incredulous. That sounds insane. How do we even know any of that stuff still exists? Some of it's hidden in the town's old museum, Emily said. The rest, I don't know. The clock ticked past 1, and outside the wailing from the forest resumed, a sound that echoed like sorrow and rage intertwined. Emily felt it deep in her bones. The curse was alive, restless, and hungry. They planned to start at the museum at first light, but neither of them slept. The night stretched endlessly, filled with restless shadows and whispered voices just beyond hearing. Morning came gray and dripping with mist. The streets of Marrow Creek were silent, save for the occasional crow's harsh call. The town's history was etched into every cracked window and sagging porch, a patchwork of forgotten dreams and buried secrets. At the museum, they were met with rusted locks and faded signs. It took them nearly an hour to pry open a side door, the hinges groaning in protest. Inside, dust motes floated in beams of weak sunlight filtering through grime-covered windows. The exhibits were relics of a time long gone: old photographs, farming tools, handwritten journals, and a display dedicated to the town's founders. Emily's eyes caught on a glass case labeled "The Garrison Legacy." Inside lay an assortment of objects: a tarnished silver dagger, a brittle lock of hair pinned carefully to a card, and an ancient, weathered candle. Jake leaned closer, whispering, "This has to be it." Emily's hand shook as she carefully lifted the dagger, the metal cold and heavy. She recalled the runes etched into the book's pages, identical to the designs on the blade's hilt. It felt like holding a shard of the past and a weapon against the darkness. They packed the items with trembling care, but the vial of holy water was nowhere to be found. They scoured the dusty shelves and cabinets, the weight of failure pressing on them with each passing minute. Then, in a forgotten corner behind a stack of crates, Emily spotted a small, cracked bottle half filled with cloudy liquid. Her breath caught. Could this be it? As she reached for it, a sudden chill swept through the room. The temperature plummeted, and the air thickened with a suffocating heaviness. Jake's voice was tense. "Did you feel that?" Emily nodded, clutching the vial. Outside, the wind began to howl again, rattling the building's old bones. They hurried back to the farmhouse, the oppressive atmosphere growing thicker with every step. The forest seemed to pulse with malevolence, shadows twisting unnaturally between the trees. Once inside, Emily placed the artifacts on the table, their presence humming with latent energy. The book lay open, waiting for the next step. As they prepared, the lights flickered, plunging the room into darkness for a heartbeat, before returning with a faint, eerie glow. A low, guttural growl echoed from the woods, distant but unmistakable. Jake's face paled. "This isn't just a story, Emily. It's real." Emily swallowed her fear. "And if we don't finish the ritual, more people will disappear. We have to be ready." The night crept in again, heavier and colder. The weight of the past, the curse, and the unknown pressed down on them like an invisible shroud. Suddenly, a tapping sound came from the window. Emily turned sharply, heart racing. A pair of eyes stared back at her, black, endless, and burning with a hunger that made her skin crawl. The glass cracked with a spiderweb pattern, spreading rapidly like a curse in motion. Jake grabbed her arm, pulling her back as the window shattered inward, shards raining like deadly rain. Something had crossed the threshold. The house groaned, the floorboards trembling beneath their feet. And outside, the forest seemed to close in, waiting. The first light of dawn struggled to pierce through the heavy mist that clung to Marrow Creek like a suffocating shroud. The world outside felt muted, as if the town itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to break the fragile calm. Emily sat rigidly by the cracked window of the farmhouse, her eyes fixed on the dense thicket of trees beyond the edge of the property. Somewhere deep within that forest, the curse stirred again, its presence palpable and ominous. Her hands still trembled from the violent intrusion the night before. Shards of broken glass lay scattered across the floor like silent witnesses to the chaos that had erupted. The thing that had crossed through that window was no longer just a story, no longer a whispered warning. It was real, and it was here. Jake paced restlessly across the room, his footsteps uneven on the creaking floorboards. The weight of the artifacts between them seemed to amplify the tension in the air, a tangible reminder of the ritual yet to be completed and the stakes they faced. "We can't wait any longer," Jake said abruptly, breaking the heavy silence. "We have to finish what we started, the binding rite, whatever it takes." Emily nodded slowly, her mind racing through the cryptic instructions etched in the book's fragile pages. The dagger, the vial of holy water, the lock of hair, all relics of a past soaked in blood and desperation. The candle made from the tallow of the black goat was still missing, and that absence gnawed at her like an unhealed wound. "Where do we even begin to find that candle?" Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake ran his hand through his damp hair. "There's only one place left, the old Jennings farm. It's been abandoned for decades, but town legends say it's cursed. They called it the Blackened Place because of the strange things that happened there." Emily felt a shiver crawl down her spine. The Jennings farm was infamous, whispered about in hushed tones at the local diner and in the dim corners of the sheriff's office. Stories of disappearances, strange lights, and unexplainable noises were woven into the fabric of Marrow Creek's haunted history. "We don't have a choice," Emily said, steeling herself. If that candle exists, that's where we'll find it. They prepared quickly, gathering their belongings and checking the artifacts once more. As they stepped outside, the fog wrapped around them like a living entity, chilling and thick. The farm lay a few miles down a narrow, winding road flanked by gnarled trees, whose skeletal branches reached out like grasping fingers. The journey there was quiet but tense, each mile drawing them deeper into a past that refused to stay buried. The air grew heavier with every step, the forest closing in as if trying to swallow them whole. When they finally reached the Jennings property, the sight was more unsettling than either had imagined. The farmhouse stood crooked and desolate, its weather-beaten boards stained dark with age and neglect. The front porch sagged under the weight of time, and the windows, shattered or clouded with grime, reflected the dim gray sky like hollow eyes. Emily's heart pounded as she stepped cautiously across the threshold. The interior was thick with the scent of decay, damp wood, mold, and something metallic beneath it all. The floorboards creaked ominously, and shadows seemed to cling to every corner. They began their search systematically, using flashlights to pierce the gloom. Old furniture lay overturned, and faded wallpaper peeled in long, curling strips. The history of despair that hung in the air was almost suffocating. In a back room, Emily found a dusty trunk, its rusty latch resisting her efforts before finally giving way with a reluctant creak. Inside were scattered papers, broken trinkets, and something wrapped carefully in oilcloth. Her breath caught. Gingerly, she pulled free a bundle, revealing a thick, black candle, its surface rough and oddly pulsating with an almost imperceptible energy. The smell was strange, a mixture of wax and something earthy, almost animalistic. Jake's voice was barely audible. "That has to be it." With the candle secured, they turned to leave, but an unnatural chill swept through the room. The air thickened and a low whispering began, swirling around them in a language that set their teeth on edge. Emily felt her skin prickle with fear, her mind scrambling to recall the warding incantations from the book. "We need to move, now." As they hurried through the darkened halls, the whispering grew louder, twisting into guttural moans and distant screams. The walls seemed to pulse, shadows stretching and writhing like living things. Suddenly, the front door slammed shut with a force that rattled the entire house. Jake lunged forward, trying the handle, but it wouldn't budge. "We're trapped," Emily gasped. A pounding started at the back of the house, heavy, deliberate, like the footsteps of something enormous. They backed away, hearts hammering, eyes darting wildly in the flickering flashlight beams. "Find a window," Jake urged. "We can't let it catch us." They scrambled toward the kitchen, where a shattered window provided a narrow escape. As Emily hoisted herself through the jagged glass, pain lanced through her arm from a deep cut. Blood welled quickly, mingling with the cold night air. Jake followed, but just as he cleared the frame, a monstrous shadow lunged, grabbing at his jacket with claws that scraped and tore. He yelped, breaking free, but the brief contact left a chill that seeped into his bones. They ran without looking back, the cursed whispers trailing behind them like a swarm of locusts. The forest seemed alive, branches clawing, roots snaring, as if the land itself was trying to reclaim what they had taken. Halfway down the lane, they paused to catch their breath in the suffocating silence. Emily's wound throbbed fiercely, but her resolve burned brighter. "We're close now," she said. "The well, the place where the ritual must be done." Jake nodded grimly. "We finish this tonight, or this town loses more than just its history." As the fog thickened once more, swallowing the road ahead, a pair of glowing eyes appeared between the trees. They blinked slowly, unblinking, waiting. Emily swallowed hard, heart racing. The curse was not done with them yet. The eyes vanished as quickly as they had appeared, leaving Emily and Jake standing alone on the deserted road, swallowed by the oppressive fog. Every nerve in Emily's body screamed in warning, but there was no turning back now. The well, the site of the ancient binding rite, was only a short distance ahead, hidden somewhere beneath the skeletal branches and twisted roots of the dense woods. The forest seemed to close in around them, every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves magnified into an ominous threat. Jake's breath came in sharp bursts, his eyes constantly scanning the shadows. "We need to be quick," he muttered, voice low and tense. "Whatever's out here, it's waiting for us." Emily clenched the black candle tightly in her bloodied hand. The wax was oddly warm, pulsing faintly like a heartbeat, as if it contained a life of its own. She could feel the weight of the past pressing down on her, the weight of every soul who had tried and failed to end the curse before her. As they pressed deeper into the forest, a sudden chill swept through the air, carrying with it a faint, lingering scent: smoke, decay, and something far darker. Emily's skin prickled, and her mind flashed back to the cryptic warnings etched in the tome. The price must be paid in blood and shadow. Ahead, the ground dropped sharply into a sunken hollow, surrounded by twisted trees whose branches formed unnatural arches, like a gateway to some other realm. In the center stood the ancient well, its stone rim cracked and worn, covered in moss and strange runes that seemed to shimmer in the dim light. Jake knelt beside it, carefully setting the candle down. This is it, the heart of the curse. Emily's gaze swept the surrounding area. The silence was thick and suffocating, broken only by the occasional drip of water echoing from the well's depths. It felt as if the entire forest was holding its breath, waiting for the ritual to begin. With trembling hands, Jake retrieved the dagger, its blade gleaming faintly despite the gloom. He handed it to Emily, his eyes locking with hers. "We don't know what's waiting down there, but if this doesn't work, there's no turning back." Emily swallowed her fear, steeling herself. She knelt by the well's edge, tracing the ancient symbols carved into the stone with her fingertips. Each mark pulsed with an eerie energy, a reminder that this place was no ordinary relic. It was a prison, a threshold between worlds. She began the incantation softly, words passed down through generations, their meaning long forgotten by most but preserved here in the forgotten tongue of the old folk. As her voice grew stronger, the candle's flame flickered wildly, casting long shadows that danced across the twisted trees. Suddenly, a low rumble shook the ground beneath them, and the air thickened with a suffocating pressure. The surface of the well water churned violently, as if something massive stirred in the darkness below. Emily's heart pounded wildly. "It's responding," she whispered. Jake tightened his grip on her arm, his eyes wide with dread. "Keep going." The ritual reached its crescendo. Emily plunged the dagger's tip into the black candle's wax, and as the blade pierced the wick, a sharp crack echoed through the clearing. A shadow erupted from the well's depths, a twisting, shifting mass of darkness that clawed its way upward with unnatural speed. The creature's form was impossible to define, a roiling tempest of black smoke and flickering eyes, emitting a chilling howl that seemed to penetrate their very souls. It surged toward them, tendrils lashing out like living shadows, seeking to consume. Jake drew a circle of salt around them, chanting fragments of the warding spell, but the shadows slipped through the cracks, curling around his legs like icy fingers. Emily gritted her teeth and held the candle high, its strange warmth pushing back against the encroaching darkness. The ground beneath them trembled violently as the shadow lunged, its voice a chorus of tortured souls screaming in a language older than time. Emily's vision blurred, and the air grew thick with despair and madness. In that moment, her mind was flooded with images, faces twisted in agony, forgotten rituals stained in blood, and the endless cycle of those who had dared defy the curse, only to become part of it. A sudden burst of light exploded from the candle, sending the shadow recoiling with a scream that shattered the stillness. Jake seized the moment, raising the dagger and plunging it deep into the well's stone rim, where the runes glowed fiercely. For a heartbeat, the forest fell silent. Then, with a deafening roar, the well collapsed inward, swallowing the darkness back into its depths. The ground cracked open beneath their feet, and Emily barely leapt away in time as the earth swallowed the sight whole. Breathless and shaken, they stumbled back toward the forest edge. But something was wrong. The oppressive weight of the curse hadn't lifted. Instead, an eerie calm had settled, unnatural and hollow. Emily looked down at her hands, trembling as a dark stain spread across her palm, an unholy mark, searing like a brand. It was a sign she hadn't expected, a price for their defiance. "Jake, I think it's not over," she said, voice trembling. He met her gaze, eyes dark with realization. "We've made it worse." Behind them, the shadows of the trees seemed to twist and writhe, as if the forest itself breathed with malevolent life. The whispering began anew, softer, but no less menacing, and from the depths of the woods, a chilling laughter echoed, a sound both ancient and terrifying, promising that the nightmare had only just begun. The silence in the house was suffocating, too complete, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting. Emily's footsteps echoed hollowly down the creaking hallway, each step a reminder that she was alone. Alone, but not safe. The cursed mark burned beneath her skin, a constant gnawing reminder that what they had unleashed was far from over. She paused before the door to the attic, hesitating as a cold draft seeped through the cracks, carrying whispers from the shadows. The weight of everything she'd learned, every story, every warning pressed heavily against her chest. The darkness in this house was not just an absence of light. It was alive, and it hungered. As she pushed the door open, a rush of cold air greeted her like a sigh from another world. The attic was cluttered with forgotten relics, old trunks, tattered furniture, yellowed photographs, and in the center, a worn wooden chest sat half open, as if inviting her in. Emily knelt and reached inside, her fingers brushing against something cold and metallic, an ancient locket engraved with symbols that matched the runes from the well. Her breath caught. This was the missing piece, the key to the curse's origin, and perhaps its undoing. Suddenly, a faint tapping sound echoed from the far corner of the attic. Emily spun around, heart pounding, but saw only shadows flickering in the candlelight. The tapping grew louder, rhythmic, like a desperate plea or a warning. She crept toward the sound, the locket clutched tightly in her hand. Then, out of the gloom, a figure emerged. Gale, the local historian who had once been so skeptical, now pale and trembling. "You shouldn't be here," he whispered, voice hoarse. "It's worse than we thought." Emily's eyes searched his face, desperate for answers. "What do you mean?" Gale swallowed hard, his gaze darting nervously toward the attic window, where the night pressed against the glass like a living thing. "The curse, it's not just tied to the land. It's tied to blood. Our blood. And now, you're marked. It's already begun to spread." A cold dread settled over Emily as Gale reached into his coat and produced a bundle of old papers. Journal entries, newspaper clippings, and faded letters that told a chilling story. The curse had twisted through generations, claiming lives, corrupting families, turning hope into despair. Emily's mind reeled. The ritual at the well hadn't broken the curse, it had only awakened its deeper, darker nature. And now the countdown had begun. Suddenly, the attic door slammed shut with a violent bang, plunging them into darkness. The tapping transformed into frantic scratching, coming from within the walls themselves. A cold, suffocating presence filled the room, and Emily felt the unmistakable sensation of unseen eyes watching her every move. "We don't have much time," Gale said urgently. "If we don't find the original source before the next full moon, the curse will consume us all." Emily's thoughts raced. The full moon was only days away, and the entity growing stronger. Every moment wasted was another step closer to annihilation. As they gathered the papers and prepared to leave the attic, the candle flickered violently, casting twisted shadows that writhed like living things. In the corner of her eye, Emily caught a glimpse of a pale figure, a child, translucent and sorrowful, reaching out with pleading eyes. A chill ran down her spine. The past was bleeding into the present, and those lost souls were trapped in a cycle of torment. Determined, Emily turned to Gale. "We need to warn the others and prepare. Whatever comes, we face it together." But outside, the wind howled through the trees, carrying with it a haunting lullaby, a song that promised sorrow, despair, and the final reckoning. The night deepened as Emily and Gale hurried down the narrow staircase, their footsteps muffled by the thick, oppressive silence of the house. The weight of the attic's revelations pressed on them both, but there was no time for hesitation. Every moment counted. The curse was no longer a distant shadow. It was a living, breathing nightmare, closing in. Outside, the wind clawed at the trees, bending branches like skeletal fingers scraping the sky. Emily pulled her coat tighter, feeling the chill that wasn't entirely from the cold air. It was something darker, something that seeped into her bones. A whisper of the curse's reach beyond the walls of the old house. Gale's face was grim as he spread the worn papers across the kitchen table. "Look here," he said, pointing to a faded newspaper clipping dated back to 1874. The headline read, "Local family vanishes amid strange occurrences." The article described how a family living on the outskirts of the county disappeared without a trace, leaving behind an abandoned farm and a legacy of whispered fears. Emily leaned closer, her fingers trembling. "They never found out what happened to them?" "No," Gale replied, "but the locals believed it was the curse. They called it the Whispering Shadow. It's been passed down through generations, tied to this land, this house." He traced a shaky finger over the text. "The locket you found, it belonged to the first victim. Legend says she was cursed after trying to break the ritual. Her spirit, trapped between worlds, warns those who dare disturb the balance." Emily swallowed hard. The thought of trapped souls lost in limbo was terrifying, and now she felt their presence haunting her every step. "We need to find the original ritual site," Emily said. "If we can reverse the curse, maybe we can save everyone," Gael nodded. "There's a place, the old well, deep in the forest. It's where the curse began, where the ritual was first performed. But it's dangerous. No one who's gone there has ever come back the same." A shiver ran down Emily's spine. The forest was dense, shadowed, and riddled with secrets, but there was no choice. As dawn crept over the horizon, Emily and Gale prepared to venture into the woods. The morning air was heavy with mist, and the world seemed muted, as if nature itself was holding its breath. They moved cautiously, the crunch of leaves underfoot loud in the eerie stillness. Every snapped twig and rustle of the underbrush set their nerves on edge. Suddenly, a low growl echoed through the trees. Emily froze. Ahead, a pair of glowing eyes reflected the pale light, watching them from the darkness. Gale pulled out a small knife, his hand shaking. "Stay close," he whispered. The creature, a massive black dog with matted fur and snarling jaws, blocked their path, its breath fogging in the cold air. Emily's heart hammered as she reached for a nearby branch, wielding it like a weapon. The dog lunged, teeth bared. In a blur of motion, Gale struck, and the beast yelped, retreating into the shadows. But Emily knew this was no ordinary animal. It was a guardian, an extension of the curse's will. They pressed on, deeper into the forest's heart, where the trees grew twisted and gnarled like ancient sentinels guarding forbidden secrets. Finally, they reached the clearing where the old well lay hidden beneath a blanket of moss and fallen leaves. The air here was thick with the scent of earth and decay. Emily peered down the dark opening, a chill crawling up her spine. "Are you ready?" Gale asked. She nodded, swallowing her fear. As they began the ritual to cleanse the well, the forest around them seemed to close in. The wind moaned mournfully, and shadows danced in unnatural patterns. Suddenly, the ground trembled beneath their feet. From the depths of the well, a guttural roar erupted, an ancient voice of rage and despair. Emily stumbled back, heart pounding as a dark mist began to rise, swirling with malevolent energy. The curse was awakening, stronger than ever. Gale chanted words from the old texts, his voice steady despite the growing chaos. Emily felt the locket's weight against her chest, its warmth spreading like fire, binding her to the ritual. But just as the darkness began to recede, a piercing scream shattered the night, a sound of pure agony and loss. From the edge of the clearing, a figure emerged. Gale's daughter, pale and gaunt, eyes vacant, her presence twisted by the curse's grip. Emily gasped, rushing to her side. "What happened to you?" The girl's lips parted in a whisper. "It's not over. It never ends." Suddenly, the earth beneath them gave way. Emily and Gale plunged into darkness, the world collapsing into silence. The cold seeped into every fiber of Emily's being as she slowly regained consciousness. Her body ached, bruised and battered from the fall, but her mind raced with urgency. The darkness that swallowed her moments ago now gave way to a faint, eerie glow, a dim light flickering from unknown sources deep underground. She tried to move, but the cold stone beneath her was unforgiving. The air was thick, damp, and carried the unmistakable scent of decay and old earth. Something ancient breathed here, something older than time itself, lingering in this forgotten underworld beneath the cursed land. Her fingers brushed against Gale's arm, cold and unresponsive. "Gale?" she whispered hoarsely, panic rising like a tide. No answer, only silence. Emily's heart pounded, but she forced herself to stay calm. She had to find a way out, for herself, for Gale, and for all those trapped in the curse's merciless grasp. The faint glow ahead revealed a narrow tunnel carved into the stone, rough and uneven. The walls were etched with faded symbols, markings that pulsed faintly with an otherworldly energy. She recognized some from the ritual books, warnings etched by those who had tried and failed to break the curse. Her breath caught as she traced the symbols with trembling fingers. Each glyph told a story of pain, sacrifice, and defiance. This was the heart of the curse, a gateway between the living world and something far darker. Steeling herself, Emily crawled forward into the tunnel. Every step echoed in the oppressive silence, her eyes adjusting to the dim light as she descended deeper. The air grew colder and shadows danced just beyond the edge of her vision. Suddenly, a low rumble shook the cavern. Dust and small stones rained from above. Panic surged. She scrambled toward a faint alcove, pressing her back against the cold rock as the earth groaned violently. The ground beneath the tunnel cracked open, revealing a chasm filled with swirling black mist, the very essence of the curse itself. Emily's eyes widened in terror as ghostly faces materialized within the mist, their hollow eyes pleading, trapped souls yearning for release. "They're waiting," a whisper echoed through the chamber, chilling her to the bone. Emily clenched the locket tightly, its warmth the only anchor in this nightmare. She remembered the words Gale had taught her, the incantation to sever the curse's hold, to free the spirits chained by the ritual. With a steadying breath, she began to chant, her voice trembling but growing stronger with each word. The symbols on the walls flared brightly, and the black mist recoiled as if burned by her defiance. But the curse was not so easily broken. From the depths of the chasm, a shadowy form began to rise, a towering figure wreathed in darkness, eyes glowing with malevolent fury. Emily's heart seized in terror. This was the curse's true form, the ancient entity feeding on pain and despair for centuries. She stumbled backward, but the entity advanced, tendrils of darkness lashing out to ensnare her. Panic threatened to overwhelm her, but she pushed forward, reciting the incantation faster, louder. The locket pulsed fiercely, emitting a radiant light that clashed with the encroaching shadows. The cavern trembled, a battle of light and dark unfolding in that forgotten place. As the entity screeched, a violent surge of energy knocked Emily to the ground. Darkness threatened to consume her senses. But then, a sudden flash of warmth, a familiar presence, stirred her soul. Gale stirred beside her, his eyes flickering open. With a raw, desperate strength, he joined her chant. Together, their voices intertwined, weaving a powerful spell of hope and defiance. The shadow shrieked in agony as the combined light pierced through its form. The black mist dissipated, the faces of the trapped souls smiling through their tears, finally free. The cavern began to collapse, stones falling and dust choking the air. Emily and Gale scrambled towards the tunnel's entrance, the ground shaking violently beneath them. Bursting into the cold morning air, they collapsed on the forest floor, breathless but alive. The first rays of dawn painted the sky, washing away the darkness of the night. But as Emily looked back towards the forest, she saw a faint shimmer near the well, an echo of the curse still lingering, a silent reminder that some shadows never fully fade. The cold morning light cast long shadows across the shattered remnants of the cursed forest, But the uneasy calm did little to ease Emily's restless mind. She and Gail lay side by side on the damp earth, breaths ragged, the ache of survival pressing heavily against their bodies. Yet, beneath the exhaustion lurked a growing dread. The curse, though weakened, had not fully relinquished its grip. Gail's eyes flickered open, revealing a deep weariness that mirrored her own. "We did it," he whispered, voice rough but tinged with hope. "We broke the curse." Emily forced a tired smile, but something in the air told her this victory was only the beginning. The forest around them seemed to pulse with a silent watchfulness, as if unseen eyes observed their every move. She struggled to sit up, the ache in her limbs sharp as broken glass beneath her skin. Her gaze drifted to the well, that black maw of darkness they had first encountered. The faint shimmer she had seen earlier still lingered like a ghostly heartbeat, a reminder that the shadows had not fully retreated. "We can't stay here," she said, voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "Not until we're sure it's over." Gail nodded slowly, reaching into his pocket to pull out a small, worn journal. "I found this in the ruins," he said, flipping through the pages carefully. "It belonged to the last person who tried to stop the curse, a man named Samuel Garrison. His notes mention a ritual site beyond the eastern ridge, something about sealing the curse once and for all." Emily's heart quickened. The journey was far from over. The ritual in the cavern had only weakened the entity, but it was clear that to truly end this nightmare, they needed to find and complete the final sealing ceremony. The sun climbed higher, filtering through the skeletal branches as they gathered their strength. Every step toward the eastern ridge felt heavier, the air thick with unseen menace. The forest seemed alive, whispering warnings in rustling leaves and distant, eerie cries that sent chills down their spines. Hours passed, the path winding through dense underbrush and gnarled trees that looked like twisted hands reaching out. The landscape grew harsher. The soil cracked and dry, as if the very life had been drained from this place. At last, they reached a clearing, a vast, circular stone altar carved with ancient symbols, weathered by centuries but unmistakably potent. The air here was cold and still, a silence so deep it pressed on their ears like a physical weight. Emily stepped forward, heart pounding. "This is it," she breathed, "the final battleground." As they prepared the ritual components, herbs, candles, and the sacred locket, the shadows around the clearing began to stir. A low growl emanated from the tree line, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and heavy. From the darkness emerged twisted figures, their forms shifting between human and something else, ghastly manifestations of the curse's will, eyes glowing with malice. They surrounded the clearing, blocking any hope of escape. Gail gripped Emily's hand tightly. "We have to finish this, now." With trembling hands, Emily began the incantation, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her throat. The air around the altar shimmered as the symbols flared with radiant light, pushing back the encroaching shadows. The figures hissed and lunged, but an invisible barrier held them at bay. The power of the ritual was real, a fragile hope against the darkness. Suddenly, the largest shadowy figure broke through the barrier and charged toward Emily. She barely had time to react before it slammed into her, knocking her to the ground. Pain exploded through her side, but she refused to give in. Gail rushed to her aid, fending off the attackers with desperate strength. Together, they fought to maintain the ritual's power. Emily's voice grew louder, the words filling the clearing with a force that seemed to shake the very earth. The shadows recoiled, their forms flickering like dying flames. The malevolent entity itself appeared, larger and more terrifying than before, a swirling mass of darkness and rage. Emily locked eyes with it, summoning every ounce of courage. "Be gone," she commanded, voice ringing with authority. "Your curse ends here." A blinding light erupted from the altar, engulfing the entity in searing flames. The air cracked with energy as the curse screamed in fury and pain. Then, silence. The clearing was empty save for Emily and Gael, both gasping for breath, bodies trembling from the ordeal. The oppressive darkness had lifted, replaced by an almost sacred calm. But as Emily looked down, the locket in her hand pulsed one last time, not with warmth, but with a cold, sinister glow. Her blood ran cold. Far beyond the clearing, in the depths of the forest, a faint, chilling laugh echoed, low, cruel, and unmistakably human. The curse had been broken, but its shadow lingered still. Thank you so much for joining me on this chilling journey into the heart of darkness. I hope this story gave you the spine-tingling thrills and haunting mysteries you were looking for. Remember, sometimes the scariest things aren't the monsters we see, but the shadows lurking just beyond our sight, the curses that linger, the secrets never fully revealed. If you enjoyed this tale, please like, subscribe, and share it with fellow horror fans who crave those eerie legends and unsettling truths. Stay safe out there and keep your eyes open, because some stories don't end when the lights go out. Until next time, this is Keys, your channel name, signing off. Sleep tight, but don't let the shadows catch you.